Um, it is my pleasure to welcome you in this last session of this colloquium, and it is perhaps fitting that we will be finishing with the most metamorphic poet of antiquity. So with no further introduction on my behalf, I will introduce the three PhD or prospective PhD candidates who will be talking in this last session, and they'll bear all the protagonism. In the first place, we have with us Frank van Den Boon, who is simultaneously enrolled in two research master programs, one on literary studies and one on classical studies at Leiden. In his research, he combines modern literary criticism with his experience as a classicist, and he has engaged in eco-criticism of Latin poetry, and today he will be exploring Orpheus' ability to control nature in Ovid's Metamorphosis Book 10, and how this might relate to the ecological crisis we are facing as humankind. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pere, for the great introduction, and thank you for having me here. Yes, today I want to talk to you about the character of Orpheus, especially Ovid's Orpheus, and the ecological crisis. By now it has become common sense that the ecological crisis has been caused by humans and the abusive relationship between humans and non-human bodies. Perhaps more than ever, the position of human on the planet is under great scrutiny. The scrutiny can, of course, be practiced in countless of manners, but when considering what classical antiquity can contribute to our discussion, I think the character of Orpheus will prove to be highly relevant. A lot of classical narratives surrounding his character present a very particular relationship between him and the non-human world around him. He's able to summon and influence all kinds of bodies, from animals, trees, rocks, other humans, with his lyrical abilities. And so I have decided to share in my paper today some preliminary ideas and arguments about the way in which one could look through the character of Ovid's Orpheus, and in order to approach the ecological crisis in a different manner and different from what I will explain in a bit. So, I will first talk about the way Orpheus has been linked to the ecological crisis before, namely in the form of the Orphic Voice, which would supposedly harmonize a dichotomy between human and nature. Then I want to close read with you from Ovid's Metamorphoses 10, a passage often called the Catalogue of Trees, or the beginning of the Catalogue of Trees. And from this close reading, I want to argue that Ovid's Orpheus is not a figure that represents harmony with the non-human, but a hierarchy over the non-human. And I will conclude by explaining how looking through this version of Orpheus gives us a different position for humans, and especially humans as poets, as creators in the ecological crisis today. So naturally, Orpheus has been invoked many times in the past to reflect upon the intricacies, the powers, the limitations of human beings. There have been many adaptations of the various narratives surrounding this character, which all emphasize different elements. There have been various philosophers and poets who worked with the character in order to create a better understanding of how poetry and poetics function in this world we live in. Too many to name. But there is one stream of thinkers specifically, which originates from the 50s, 60s from last century, who invoke Orpheus in a very specific way, namely by using the term the Orphic Voice. And one of the first scholars to have built upon the notion of the Orphic voice is Elizabeth Schuell. And in her 1960 study called The Orphic Voice, Poetry and Natural History, she interprets the lyrical abilities of Orpheus to influence the world around him in a way that, to me, when I first heard it, sounded very recognizable. Orpheus is the mythical bard who can delightfully enthrall every human, animal and plant with his music. His compositional abilities are so in tune and harmonious that everyone listening, both human, animal, plant, become one with each other and one with music. So there's this harmonizing or unifying aspect that resides or is seen to be residing in the character of Orpheus. And it has thus been used, the Orphic voice has thus been, that harmonizing or unifying aspect in Orpheus has thus been called the Orphic voice. And it has been used as a way to designate a type of poetry, a type of creation that can bridge a supposed dichotomy between human and nature. So there's this ideal of holism, where we can bring human and nature into one glossed over whole. And this is present in many discourses on eco-criticism and sustainability as well. And as a consequence, this idea of the Orphic voice and Orpheus as a figure of harmony has been picked up by some environmentalist scholars. For example, the political scientist Schuell Jung, in an essay called The Orphic Voice and Ecology, he argues the following. In the universe, where everything is perceived to be related to everything else in a circle or a round way, music, poetry, and ecological thinking are consonant or rounded. As Orpheus, with his singing and his lyre, made the whole of nature dance in delight, this paper has been inspired by his legend and is also its echo and remembrance. It is a plea to return to the Orphic voice as the sound basis for developing an ecological ethic, which is still in its infancy. It as the beginning of an ecotopia. I won't go into all too much detail of Jung's theory, but in his essay, he clearly opts for a new ecological ethic, a new way to look at the relationship between human and non-human, which is based on unifying the two, seeing a dichotomy and trying to unify it, creating a consonance that has its foundations in the consonance of music and poetry. And Orpheus then becomes the exemplary poet, the one who is able to make the whole of nature dance in delight, the choreographer who can create this harmony. So to represent it visually, in a world of divergent and discordant bodies, human, animal, nature, objects, instruments, etc., the power of Orpheus would lie in his ability to unify those bodies into a whole. And with this ethic of harmonization, human and nature should then supposedly be able to emerge out of the ecological crisis stronger. In my paper, then, I decided to close read Orpheus' story from Ovid's Metamorphoses, book 10, but from another perspective, with some of the concepts introduced by philosopher Bruno Latour. And Latour, he is not that much in favor of holistic models to try and unify human and nature in this crisis we live in. Rather, he seeks to establish an ecological ethic that is based on understanding the disparity between different types of bodies. And the key term for Latour in understanding this disparity is agency. Every body, from a brick in the wall to a tree outside of this building, has a type of agency. And our language has the ability to represent that agency. Animals can run, but so does your refrigerator. plants grow, but so do our babies, and we stand on our legs, but so does a table. While we are able to represent agency within different bodies, however, there's a tendency, and Latour calls this tendency the usual reading grid. The tendency to distribute representations of agency asymmetrically among bodies. So, for example, we are used to represent alive bodies as having agencies and non-alive bodies as having none. So humans would have the most agency, while objects would have the least, and plants and animals are often put someplace in between based on the criterion of locomotion, for example. And this is a quantitative scale, as you can see, of one type of agency, as if agency would be one thing that we can represent without variations. And building on this, Latour shows that this mode of representation can be diverted as well. He says that this kind of representation of agency is something that is operational in our language and that we can diverge from as well. Seeing that it is a conscious operation, he calls these operations animation or de-animation, or in narratological terms, subjectivization and objectivization. And our usual reading grid then often consists of subjectivizing human bodies as a center with passive objects around it, as we can see from heroic stories. And we often call non-humans settings, things that are on the background for the human hero to play its role in. So, if we acknowledge that there's not one type of agency that we distribute among bodies, but acknowledge that every type of body has a type of agency, the question does not become whether a type of body has agency, but what kind of agency a body has, and in what way those types of agencies interact with each other. And we can try to understand how different bodies exist in this world. So, with this distribution of agency in mind, I want to close read with you one passage of the Orpheus cycle in Metamorphoses, Book 10, and consider what role subjectivization and objectivization play. So in my paper, I have investigated the passage right before Orpheus starts to sing, the moment that Orpheus' abilities to make nature dance in the light, as Jung frames it, come to the fore. So this is the beginning of the catalogue of trees. Oh, I see something went wrong with the spacing. But you can read along in Latin and I'll read the translation. There was a hill, and on that hill an entirely flat field which showed green with shrubs of grass. The place was devoid of shadows. And after the bard, born from the gods, sat in that place and moved his resounding strings, the place was full of shadows. The tree of Chaon was not absent, nor the Heliad woods, nor the Italian oak, nor the etc., etc. That is the beginning of the catalogue of trees. So what do we see? We see Orpheus, who has just lost Eurydice for the second time, and he sits down on a hill. He's ready to start lamenting her with song. But as is common in Latin poetry, the poet needs an inspirational surrounding, a pastoral locus amoenus, before he can begin composing. And so Orpheus decides to transform this rather empty hill into a locus amoenus by adding one of its distinctive elements, the cool shadow of trees. And so he creates those shadows by playing his music. Those trees, they come moving towards him and give him shadows. But the thing is, once those trees are there, he arranges them in a very particular manner. There are various kinds. I've just cited the beginning, but there are, the 15 verses comprise about 26 types of trees Because of the form that it takes in the catalog, we can see that this composition this compositional ability of Orpheus to arrange those trees in a specific way reflects the compositional abilities of Orpheus to create poetry in general. It kind of preludes the songs that he is about to sing as well, in the sense that he is already showing his compositional abilities in these trees. So the salient detail I want to focus on is then that Orpheus is able to lure these trees, to create this locus amoenus by himself. Other instances of the locus amoenus would present the poet being in them, moved to them, even sometimes create poetry with them, right? In cases of reverberation that often occur. And in those cases, there's a clear division of agencies. The non-human locus amoenus has the agency to inspire the poet, and the poet in turn has the agency to create poetry in response. There is a clear division of agencies which is represented in a common locus amoenus and a poet, and they respond to each other, and in that way division of agency can be examined. However, this kind of transaction is abated when the poet has the ability to create this locus amoenus himself. The ability to subsume this inspiratory agency under his own. And this is then what we encounter in the case of Orpheus. By being able to create the locus amoenus himself and arrange it exactly the way he wants to, Orpheus subordinates any agency of the locus amoenus to his own. And as a result, Orpheus is able to predetermine the incentive to create poetry himself. He doesn't need inspiration. He can create it himself out of nowhere. And the distribution of agency in this scenario is then seen to be very asymmetrical. The trees of the locus amoenus are the passive objects under subject to Orpheus' spell, and Orpheus has the ability to subsume its agency altogether. So thus far, one might recognize, of course, in this representation, the way that humans have a dominant position over non-human bodies in the world we live in. But Orpheus offers a reflection on the artifice of this position as well. In my paper, I have tried to establish that by pointing to the interchangeability between Orpheus and the author Ovid. There are quite some arguments that favor reading in Orpheus a figure of the author of the Metamorphoses himself. I will not go into detail, but most important are the fact that Orpheus is an embedded narrator. The songs that he sings are metamorphosis stories in themselves, which makes the embedded narration of Orpheus come very close to the actual narration that Ovid does with the entire epic. And the second is an allusion in the beginning of the Metamorphoses in which Ovid equates himself to the character of Orpheus in Apollonius Rhodius. So there are plenty of arguments to equate the two. So when we think of the narrator of the Metamorphoses, or Metamorphoses 10 specifically, and we see that we think of Ovid and Orpheus as converging into one author, the outcome is a kind of mise en abîme in which Orpheus becomes the paradoxical author of his own character. And if we accept this as a consistent element of Orpheus' authorship, we can make some interesting conclusions, I think. For we have now seen that Orpheus is, in the first place, installed as a subject center who has subsumed the agency of the locus amoenus to his own disposal. But as Orpheus becomes the character, becomes the author of his own character and narrative, This installment itself falls under Orpheus' authorship as well. Orpheus is not only on the receiving end of this lopsided distribution of agency, Orpheus is the distributor himself as well. And this is then the power of the poet as Orpheus represents it in Ovid's Metamorphoses. It lies in the fact that the poet has the potential to write and also rewrite their own narrative, to author their own position in relation to other bodies. So, if we read in Orpheus the ability of the human as poets to rewrite their own narratives and position in the world, what does that contribute to the ecological crisis of today? I wish to make two small conclusions. First of all, the interpretation of Orpheus shows that a holistic worldview based on the Orphic Voice that is supposed to unite human and non-human as one is still characterized by an asymmetric division of agencies that favors anthropocentrism. As Orpheus inhabits the position of harmonizer, the one responsible for structuring and arranging the world as one whole, any ideal of holism is immediately undermined by the superior position that the Orphic Voice has over other bodies. So, if we wish to decenter human in this world we live in right now, the Orphic Voice is not a viable thought to do so, in my opinion. Secondly, the character of Orpheus shows how the authorship of humans as poets consists of the potential to rewrite their own narrative and configure their positions in the world in a specific manner. The Orphic Voice is a form of imagination, of thinking how the world could be, looking through Orpheus to the world we live in right now. And so, as much as we are able to imagine ourselves as composers or harmonizers of the world, we are just as much able to establish ourselves differently. We could perhaps try to find a form of poiesis that is entirely different, that does not rest upon centralizing the human force behind poiesis. And in that way, there would be a manner of poiesis, perhaps, that could destabilize anthropocentrism, the anthropocentrism that is fundamental for the ecological crisis. I will round up. One question that the story of Orpheus does not approach is how one could do that. Orpheus, he does not act upon the potential to rewrite his position in the world. He rather reifies his position by subjectivizing himself. But his voice, the Orphic Voice, so what we do understand is that how he does this is by use of poetry, by use of music, by use of language. And poiesis thus becomes a key to imagining a new position that might help us deal with the ecological crisis. The question remains, how? Thank you very much.